this video, I want to show you a few tips, tricks, techniques using John Singer Sargent as inspiration. So we are going to try to keep a sketching mindset all the way through this piece. So as we watercolor, we want to make sure we see the big and simple and stay with that mindset of big, simple shapes all the way through the piece without having to fall into that temptation of adding unnecessary details. It's a fun way to get the most out of how to use your creativity with brush strokes and watercolor techniques, and I think it's going to be fun. So let's get to it. So can I use a few pencil lines? So if you look closely, he did add some pencil lines, and that would be mostly to just capture perspective and a bit of the features, just a guide to where he wants to go. But even the color goes outside or inside the line, meaning it's just basically a visual, not, I mean, when we talk about sketching, this isn't as loose of a sketch as you could get. So attempting that, I'm going to find just the major lines here and hopefully make this 100% blind drawing, which is guaranteed what he did. Just adding a few lines, touches for where some of these elements, the biggest elements here, belong. And you can see some of the lines, some of the pencil lines are actually do show up. And also, in order to preserve some of the light, where would we want to preserve some of this light? We're going to want to see that. And there we have it. We have a few steps here. So this is just a couple brush strokes and a little bit of light. And there we go. So if you can see, there's just a couple scratchy lines there. But what I want to do today is really bring in with the proper brush. So today, this brush may be too big for this format. So I'm going to bring my second favorite, a little bit smaller. And you're familiar with this one. You've seen it before. Our quill, it's a squirrel. Natural hair that really handles moisture and line. A little more refined, you actually can see. And then obviously my strategy. So when I begin this sketch, what do I want to do? It's as a watercolor painting, we start from biggest, simplest, lightest, and build up. But here, with the background, where would the background be? How do I preserve some of the light? So take a few seconds, a few minutes to really strategize, and then make sure you set up your color palette. So we work with some earth tones. We had that yellow ochre or some of the sienna colors for the warm. And you can actually bring them in, just test them on there as a part of your sketch. Loosen it up just a little bit. I want to do a little bit of wet on dry, wet on wet. And I think this very light sienna color is going to really work here. And I'm just going to go in and give some of the qualities of the warmer colors first. Very, very light. And I should mention this always. It's not a race. This is not about how fast can you do this. It's looseness that starts with the way you see it, the way you think about it, but the patience to think your way through, to mix your colors, to plan if you have some of the layers. And slowly, really just begin to see more and more of the pieces of the puzzle and break them down. I'm going to add a little bit of warmth right in here. Just a drop of it. So far I'm using a light, it's a raw sienna. And I touched a little bit of burnt orange here, just a touch of it. And I began to do a little tiny bit of a mix, but most of it is just sienna color here. So what I want to do now is I'm going to bring in a touch of burnt umber and sketch some of the lower shapes down here. Maybe begin to bring in some of that water and water reflection, bringing up a little bit of consistency as well, saturation of the pigment, and squinting. So once I begin squinting, I really want to break the blocks here of how does it stand out? How do I begin to develop that bigger, simple, and light into just a little bit beyond, or what I call second stage, while still remaining in an open format, almost as if it was the first, and it is still the first layer. Let me bring in just a touch of yellow ochre that I want to mix with a tiny bit of sienna and bring a little more, a variety of warmth to this wall here with a couple spaces of light. Just open brush strokes. I want to begin to do a little bit of wet on wet and a little bit of lifting. So with my sketching, as I sketch with watercolor, yes, I do have those pencil lines. I almost don't even go by them anymore. It was just, do I have a composition right? So I could, but ideally one day you want to just come in and do this direct with watercolor and see how it goes. Those pencil lines, just to help you get that confidence, okay, everything's in its place or pretty close to where it needs to be. And everything else as if you were sketching with color. Once you enter that, you're beginning to think about how sketching with a brush, but also the technique, meaning I'm going to let some of these areas dry a little. So I'm going to neutralize. I'm going to bring in a little bit of ultramarine blue, and I'm going to touch it with a tiny bit of rose madder or a cool red, alizarin crimson, quinacridone red, maybe too cool for this one. And I want to go into the blue violet, just a bit of the blue violet area, a little more blue and cool. And I'm going to touch that with a tiny bit of the sienna to neutralize it. So I can get a tiny light cooling effect for the upper area of this wall. You begin to see that, and also making sure the timing is right, so you could maybe add that and see it mix or layer with the colors that you have there previously. Some of them are still wet. And that neutralizing effect immediately gives it this sense, a feel of, yep, that looks a little more real. And then bringing a little more of this blue, just a touch more ultramarine. I'm going to just wash, knowing that I could create different effects of light here. So we're still looking at lights, how we neutralize some of the color to hint at shadows. A little more sienna or yellow ochre. Beginning to get some of these brown grays. And really, really loose. Remembering to, okay, what is this about? Oh yeah, that's right. Looseness, breathing through it, thinking your way through, pausing. Now there's a really beautiful color I like to mix, yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, and from there, you can begin to see if it's too cool or too warm by touching it with a tiny bit of a cool or warm red. And that's what I'm doing here. So I started with ultramarine blue, touched it with yellow ochre, got that gray almost to where I wanted, paid attention to the consistency of it. I want this still very, very light. I'm going to bring second and third touches of that variation with almost gives you that sense of just a little extra shadow. I could do some of these second layer touches here. All of it with that nice, beautiful sketching quality. And the beauty of how you begin to see this come together. And when you come to the realization, oh my goodness, is it really this easy? When you just do it loose and sketchy and almost carefree, but with good strategy of analyzing your color palette, knowing how to go to those areas of the color wheel where you can match and begin to really understand what you're seeing. Notice I'm deepening by adding more ultramarine blue. I made this a little bit, there's more consistency. There's a little deeper feel to the pigment, but also there's more gray or almost black feel to it, creating that sense of shadow. Now, as always, you don't want to skip steps. You want to stay with the biggest, simplest. Don't move into the details before you're supposed to. I'm going back into the sienna, and I'm going to bring in just a little bit of that mix, that gray mix that I have from the ultramarine, ultramarine and yellow ochre. But burnt umber is another, that one gets a different variation of gray all the way to black, actually. And let's bring it over here. We're still avoiding this wall, and we have that nice, beautiful turquoise that will come next. And then those lines of perspective. So as you could see here, let me just move this a little bit this way. So here you could see those edges and how I maintain through simple sketch the line quality. And it gets a little bit warmer, so I'm going to go back into this yellow ochre. And I've been mentioning this over and over. We talk about the accuracy, your level of expectation, what it is you're looking for or to achieve with each stroke. Being okay with doing variations to the theme, like bringing, not because it's accidental, you're in control, but if it's not what we consider perfect, play with it. You're playing with shapes of color, and as you add a new layer, a new shape, a new shade, it opens up new roads that you could take, new areas that you can go explore. Like, ooh, I'm liking this. Well, I'm supposed to go into the greens and turquoises here, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to grab just a tiny bit of I'm going with a little bit of olive green, and I'm going to neutralize it. First, let's try, and I want to make it a little warmer, so a little bit of yellow ochre. Just a little bit. And I want to see that nice bright green right in here. Maybe a little too yellow still. And you see a little bit almost of viridian. In my case, I'm going to use a little bit of phthalo green. Mix that and touch it right in there. And we're going to go to the other side. Same approach with that phthalo green. And I'm going to touch it with, if I go with ultramarine blue, let's do an experiment. I have a phthalo green, viridian green, and I went with ultramarine blue, and it gives me almost a turquoise color that could play, and I do see it pop up here. So I mixed my own turquoise, but I do have a turquoise in my palette that I may want to use just to add to the combination of colors there. Expand that range. And really loosen up, really just keep a few strokes where you see that. Now the other thing is, don't make up information that you can make up information, you can play with it, you can do variations, but there's a difference between making up information consciously and unconsciously, just adding strokes without really thinking why you're doing that. Having a plan of, okay, this is going to add to the contrast of temperature, of the contrast of edge. This is going to bring out the complementary color. Begin to do those exercises of processing. Let's see, go a little more into ultramarine. And now I'm going to mix that with a little bit of my turquoise, cobalt turquoise, and wash that right in here with a little bit of wet on wet. And then I mentioned I wanted to bring just a touch of it right up here to do a variation of those colors. And I do like that already, even more so than the one I mixed up here. As it's drying, it has a little more opaque. So let's just touch that with turquoise, and it just enriched it. Going back to ultramarine blue, looking for a little more beyond the blue violet. Now I want to go a little closer to purple, and I'm adding ultramarine, which is a warm blue, with a cool red, and trying to bring, now again, making sure we're at the right stage and moisture here. Squinting and seeing all of the areas of the work where you need to play with that color. Notice what Sargent does here. He has this beautiful, call it purple, violet play color here, and how it pops up here and somewhat here through some of the two strokes on the stairs, just right at the edge, and then over here on our door frame. Do you see it anywhere else? Then you go ahead and bring out a little more of it. And again, the danger, too much. Notice he just keeps it so, what would that be? Quiet? Quiet but eloquent. And I do have to kind of begin to wait a little bit for areas to begin to dry, as I plan to bring in a little bit of, this is where we begin to saturate just a little more. Adding a second stroke here and there. Having some of the color begin to just blend while it's still wet. Doing that very, very carefully. So one of the tips is, when you mix a color, I mention this all the time, most of the secrets or the tricks of the illusion happen on the palette. The way you mix the colors starts with the colors you pick. You select a few colors that you're going to mix. So a limited palette is always a great way to start. Then you decide how to mix those colors and where to put them. When you begin to use a color too much and it starts becoming a little random and you can't control how much of it is where or everywhere, and you juggle, and there's a danger of losing control because we are juggling lots of different elements here when you think about it. Starting with water, pigment, all the elements of the infinity of techniques we can apply, but just with the mixture of those colors, the contrast and the variation, I notice I'm beginning to struggle. So I gotta read a little more looseness into the mixture of colors here. Lots of wet on wet. And I want to see this a little more gray. So there's a bluish green, but it's really neutral towards the gray while still being able to read that beautiful. And it may be starts with a green maybe. So we need to do a little quick test. Just a quick test. Is it warm? Is it cool? So I'm using a little bit of cobalt blue. And I think I'm really getting close. And I did cobalt blue. I started with a little bit of olive green. And cobalt blue almost got me there. And I'm afraid to actually go into ultramarine, but just a tap of ultramarine may give it that final, yep, there it is. And I want to maybe bring that right in here. Making sure I preserve some of that white, making sure I sketch it in. You have to see these, the way they are set as shapes, but also while you can handle that, try to focus on how can I make the technique read a little bit better. And you don't want this to get, again, overcooked. So I'm waiting just a little for it to dry. I'm going to lighten just a variation of turquoise right in here. Ultra light. Lift just a little bit, just a hint of color there. And this is going to have to get more wet on wet. So let me just wash, soften the edge. Lots of soft edges at the end here. Lots of wet on wet. Tiny bits of shifting colors with a little bit of, it almost looks like yellow ochre going towards pink. A little tiny bit of warming up. So I'm going to consider now going into second and third layers that are going to get just a little bit darker and more saturated. So I'm going to start with a little bit of burnt umber. And for this first burnt umber, I almost want it to be wet on wet. So I have edges to consider here. And I just watered down a bit of burnt umber so I could drop it in very, very light and use that moisture to do a little more wet on wet. So just there. Bring that right over here. Trying to get that first shape, and what I want to do is get that depth, that cave-like reading of light as well. That blends with the outer. Notice how it's really sketchy. Don't get too tight. as you deal with this and making sure everything else that needs to be dry is, I'm going to do the same right in here. Making sure you have the right brush also. And beginning to read and see how amazing. And I'm just putting this also just as drawing markers for a second and third layer, all of these wet on wet. You can see how it really starts coming together. Now I'm going to go into a little bit of ultramarine blue, not black, ultramarine blue, touch some of that into the burnt umber, and begin to just drop that in. Let that wet on wet. Just begin to get, adding a little more ultramarine, and it's almost reaching black now. And there it is. Just dropping that in. And although it's still very wet, I do want that looseness of that technique. And a nice edge, a nice good quality to the opposite side of that edge, so you can maintain the illusion of the line, the shapes, creating that line with beautiful perspective. There we go. Not much to it. So you begin to break down some of these smaller shapes. But now, seeing them as second layers, you're going to add a little bit of consistency to the paint, a little more saturation, but very carefully, not going too dark. Not quite yet. And deepening. Some of them you really absolutely have to completely switch your brush if you're not sure that it'll capture that detail that you need. Some of it is becoming really refined, super thin and fine. So you want to make sure you have that contrast of sharpness as well. That could really work, really benefit. And I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to switch this brush now. We have most of the major things I wanted to capture here. Pretty set. So the looseness that you show on your palette really begins to show on your work. There is no way to fake it. It just shows. I guess there's ways to fake it. I'm going to go into my rose madder, touch just a tiny bit of rose madder right over here on this edge. Let that mix a little more with this burnt orange. So switching to a smaller, finer point brush. Also, I'm going to use a synthetic now. This velvet, the black velvet, with the super sharp point, and also the level of moisture that I'm going to be using here. It's going to be very little, more manageable for some of these as I mix my color, and I could come in and just do some of the final drawing. Actually, some of this edge here could benefit from that. This is a beautiful brush to do that. You really, truly feel like you're drawing here. And I think I'm going to be using this one a lot for that second image that we're working on today. Because a lot can happen. With a lot more patience, you could bring some of that same quality of the big brush a little more controlled. Let's go back into that burnt umber, neutralize it a little with, this time I'm going to use cobalt blue, get that a little grayer. Don't want to sharpen these edges too much. I'm also paying attention. Don't get too carried away with overbuilding some of that sharpness, because then you lose the quality of that softness. So some of these edges just, they're very light. They're here and there. But they're not just everywhere for gratuitously. You got to almost plan them. The shifting of the color, the shifting of the value, and how that allows it to take shape, to come together. Just a little more water. This one's interesting, going back into more ultramarine blue, really trying to get, and maybe even a touch of turquoise. Let's do the bottom first. And some of them are almost like just little ghosts of lines. And he's totally fine with that, and I love it. But making good decisions with your color mixing, understanding your color saturation, how you apply that color, that technique, in terms of value of that color, and the variations of value and color that you could do with just one area of that color wheel. Just by shifting, adding a touch of the complementary, neutralizing. There's a lamp here. There's a nice source, light source. I'm not really going to mess with that too much. One of the variations there. It's beginning to get a little too dark. So I'm going to lift just a tiny bit of the sharpness here. Let that be a little more wet on wet all around. So how did you manage your looseness? Were you paying attention to it? Is it something you have to think about a lot, or can you just, without overthinking, make it part of the way you work naturally? I'm nearing the end here, where just a few extra strokes. Right as I deepen the darkest areas. Added lots of ultramarine here, going a little bit beyond that violet with that burnt umber, but wanting to maintain the temperature. And you see these quick little brush strokes, like swooshes, but I want them to really contrast. So the saturation is also a little bit deeper. And I do this by squinting. I see this because I'm squinting. So there's a reed of how it should work, how it would work because you're squinting. But there's also something where you could over squint. So caution, knowing that squinting too much, you begin to enter abstraction, and I love that. But if that's not what you're looking for, then using the squinting technique as you need it and no detail. I'm going to actually touch a tiny bit of ivory black, just a tiny bit, and wait for the moment and just bring it right over to this edge. Maybe just a little bit right here too. And there we have it. I still could get a little more detailed. And again, when I say detailed, it's not stiff. It's some of the small, tiny little areas where I want it to look more finished. But I'm happy with that sketch look that we, in the beginning, as we planned, was what we were looking for. There we have it. I think that's where I need to stop as I get ready. Just thin this area of the wall just a little bit to work on our next version. So I gotta say, I would be very happy with this. Forgot to mention, I did add masking tape for the frame, which is how I'm working on all of these pages of my sketchbook, just to keep a little bit of consistency. Now that they're finished, we could see how immediately it adds, well, it's the framing, of course, and how color all of a sudden takes a different, the color and the edge of those shapes of color. Read as a finished piece. There we go. Would you use pencil lines, or can you just go in and maybe try to make this as abstract as possible and start from there, just like we did with the previous one? And that's what I'm going to try to do. So first I'm going to add a little bit of tape, same thing to the edges. If you need a few pencil lines, then absolutely you do that. But the idea is start big, broad brush, and then get smaller and smaller, and finally those pencil lines would be that thin, heavy finishing brush with saturated color, darkest colors at the end, giving us the line work, that final edge work. Because there is a lot of detail here. When you look at it, there's a lot of detail to deal with. But when you perceive all the arabesques and arches and textures of the wall, and so I think this is a perfect, there we are, example of how do we fight that urge to overdraw, over work those areas of detail. And I'm going to go ahead and, starting with no drawing, I'm going to use my big brush, big broad strokes of color. I'm going to use this neutral color that I had. It's a yellow ochre. Actually, I'm sorry, this was burnt umber with ultramarine blue, and it just really watered it down here. And I'm going to start right off the bat with what I think is one of the most important elements here, as I squint as hard as I can. Drawing, but I'm drawing with the brush. I also want some of that technique to show up. There's a beautiful little shadow here. So the risk of drawing with the brush is, how confident are you that you can see the marking and work with the composition that you're setting yourself up to? Maybe there was a little more angle, so if the angle shifts a little, that's fine. This would be almost like urban sketching. You feel like, okay, you're on site. You could have done a pencil sketch, but I'm going to go right into drawing with color and brush. Mixing our colors, setting yourself up for beautiful layers. Remember, one of the things Sargent did with his watercolors was also the work he did with knowing how to preserve some of those whites where he needed a little extra play with the temperature of those colors. So we see him work with these beautiful like coral pinks or violets, and the range of violets and grays that he can use, neutral colors. They're not truly vivid. He's going a little more for that natural neutral look of the world with nice, beautiful lights and shadows. That's basically it. So playing with color. How far are you willing to go? There's going to be maybe a little bit of wet on wet here. I'll live with it. So you don't see me, but the squinting that I'm doing here is extreme. And that's what you want to do when you identify these early shapes here. So remember, I started with no drawing, but I do want to visualize, okay, there's elements right in here as well. So I could sort of manage that. And not paint or draw through that area. Letting a lot of this paint just blend in. Just adding a few lines, almost again, drawing with the brush for the reflection of this water here and that beautiful color repeating right at the edge. Beautiful way of drawing, painting water. It's just reflective quality. Make sure you capture the shapes and the color, and then that beautiful shadow in the middle. I'm gonna go back. So far, again, yellow ochre. I touched it with rose madder. I got this beautiful warm wall color here, like that coral pink. For this, I used that leftover burnt umber, ultramarine, grayish neutral mix. Here, I'm gonna go into Again, yellow ochre, and I'm going to touch it with, this time, let's see if I could go from there, thinking about a little bit of ultramarine blue. Yeah, and it does give me this deeper. Knowing your temperatures, way warmer, definitely earthier. No red. And now I'm really drawing here, really making sure I capture the shapes and the position of those shapes where they need to be. And what I don't want to do is overthink my drawing as well. I want that looseness of the sketch to still kind of show through all these marks. It's going to take a little while for that to draw. It was still too wet, so maybe a little lifting here. Make this arch just a little bit rounder. So using all of your techniques as well. And obviously the timing for some of these edges was not ideal. But again, laying down layers. Still too wet. Let's go to this bottom part. Work a little bit with that shadow, but we also have that warm color, cooler color to the stone. I'm going to keep it very light. And maybe add a little bit of the streak, like the perspective of it, by applying my line, if it shows up with the angle, with the direction of it. There's also some light and shadow playing there, so you want to make sure you have variations. But again, it's fighting that urge to overwork the details here. So how would I continue strategizing this? I'm going to bring in some of that color. Need to bring some of that color right in here. Just a little more yellow ochre. Just working softly. What I want to read as reflections, it doesn't have to be. Thinking of that urge once again. That urge we have to push, control the look, that detail. Let's go back into the burnt umber, and we're going to make a little more, mixing it with burnt ultramarine blue, that beautiful gray that almost reaches black. And then you see that shape pop up again. the shadow. And I am working just a little too wet on wet right now. So also a little bit of patience. So I'm using that color to begin to shape just the edges. Notice how wet it is still. Bring in some of that right in here as we develop what I think is the key element. Still very wet. So drawing it here takes a little bit of understanding how you're going to work the edges between and still maintain that looseness. So you can begin to appreciate, really important, how hooked are you on the need to be very specific with what you consider details. How precise do they need to be? And that's overall. So I'm just going to work a little bit of the shadow here. And some of the lines which we're going to begin to see more and more and more. But already you could begin to see, yeah, it's working. Maybe the composition was a little bit off here and there. But you could see how Sargent would loosen up and maybe begin to describe a little bit of this for us through simple. This one just got a little heavy there. There we go. And your level of looseness. Getting a little more saturated here. This paper is really wet, but I love it because it's going to be somewhat loose as it begins to get more and more sharp line. I mentioned at some point I needed to switch to a smaller brush. I'm going to add a little extra contrast to the shadow. As it begins to dry, it shows a little too soft. So burnt umber, ultramarine blue. begin to layer a little bit of that shadow right over this, hoping it's dry enough so it maintains that quality. I'll have to come back into this other area of color, which will be, I want to make it, I love this color. That's the reason I really keep going to it. Just apply that generously. Notice I'm scumbling, really trying to stay away from trying to control the details and letting that just open up even some of the mixing of the color on the page now, which I love. It's happening. I think it's time for me to switch brushes. And I can come in and begin to just soften up some of this with technique, bring in a little stroke, a little bit of water, and add a little water to the edge, generate more of that wet on wet, and push it to the side, creating almost automatic texture. Bring in a little more of this color here as it begins to dry, so it showcases just a little bit better the intention of that line. And now it's all about creativity. You really want to be creative here. Think through, what are the elements that are working? You know they're simple. Line, shapes, the color of those shapes. And then you think about the relationships. Contrast, sharpness, soft, hard edge, wet, dry, wet on wet, and how all of them begin to give you beautiful alternatives to mix and match those elements. And that's all they are. Elements, blocks that you could play with. Now the squinting begins to get more and more in this case, I guess, we're getting more complex. So for example, you see some of these and you feel, ooh, all that detail you want to make sure you capture. So I'm going to start really light, really soft, with just a hint of what's happening with the overall. And then work these shadows in. That's what the trick is. Some scumble, and then squinting that deeper color of shadow. Obviously, there's always more through technique that you can play with and do those architectural features, or following a different technique, get really, really specific with that. Not what I would recommend for the exercise, though. Adding more shadow to this side. Covering more of that light, so we read that beautiful shadow coming across as what was the focal point, the kind of essence of this sketch. really breaking down and almost wanting to remain in the big, simple strategy as long as possible. If you could do that all the way through, that's an achievement. If you stay big and simple all the way through and you find something satisfying in the end, that is a good way to go. A good way to think your way through it as well. All you do is add a little bit of shadow and boom. Look at that, we created some perspective here. No need to add all the lines, again, refuse the temptation to go into just excessive detail. If anything, that's what Sargent, it looks like he put a lot of detail into his work sometimes, but the truth is that he made perfect use of those elements of line, color, contrast, obviously value, and then color temperatures, giving us even more richness. Things to read. I'm forgetting a little bit about this area here. Let's go right in. Add a little water squiggle here, more wet on wet. Just understanding how you break those shapes and see the color for what it is. How you manage the technique. I'm a little too wet on wet here, but I'm just testing it. I'm liking it. We're in the area of the shadows, so it really just can't hurt it. I gotta be patient. And that would make it work better, but so far, ooh, that's a nice shadow there. The magic of seeing the power of a simple trick to create that illusion. And at some point, knowing when to just leave it alone. Which I'm very close to. I'm very close to just wanting to step away. There's one little thing, and I really want to be sure that, number one, it's fully dry, but there's a tiny touch of color. The specks of, I'm going to bring in a warm yellow. This is New Gamboge. It's a little more saturated, and I'm going to touch it right at the top of these right here. Just to add that feel of extra visual, all the reading that we see, and there's tons of patterns and color, but I don't want to overdo that. I'm just tapping it on. Just a few more strokes here. Mimicking the opposite side. And And this is a piece you could try with lots of variation, maybe more detail, less detail. With drawing, so starting from a place of adding the line and then working the color as we would usually do a watercolor, to see how much line detail you feel you need to put in there. So this one, just to remember, we started without any pencil lines, going with big, broad brush strokes, simple colors, started with just the angle, and little by little, going from the big to the small. Oops. And it looks better when I squint at it, because most of the time I was squinting at the reference. So I'm happy with that result, because it does look like what I was saying. And I'm risking it here, adding more detail, these small little arch or the curves at the top with a little bit of pattern and shadow in there. And again, how far is too far? I'm reaching it. I feel like I'm borderline coming over to that place where one tiny bit, one stroke, and it would be too much. So right there is where I would stop. Eventually, when it's fully dry, I would come back in just a little bit. And I don't think it really needs it, but if you feel areas where, okay, it could really use maybe just a few lines in here to identify the area of pattern on the door, that's shadow, but does it really need that? Is that my focus for what I was looking at here? No, I think it was a nice, beautiful architectural courtyard with a nice, beautiful shadow coming across, with the water reflecting some of that. And I think it is achieved. So why push it any further? I think you have to remember, we already have a photograph of it. You can take a picture of it. So why would you compete with taking a picture of it? What you want to do is this. You want to really just let it be new. Let it show you where your technique, your creativity, a new vision of it. So there's a way to have fun with the way you see anything, and then bring it to the paper, to the page. With broad watercolor strokes, you saw that we almost could have created something abstract from that reference. But as you begin to push and use those elements of line, color, contrast, temperature, and deal with how far you need to go with it, as far as pushing the layers, pushing the lines, pushing what we all know as details, and not running the risk of overcooking your drawings and your paintings. So I hope you had fun today, and I hope you learned something new.